Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this fourth lecture in our RZSS Tribal Elders series. We were very fortunate to have Dame Jane Goodall join us as our first Tribal Elder, and she was followed by esteemed Professors Aubrey Manning, OBE, and Roger Wheater, OBE, who we are delighted to have in our audience with us tonight. For any of you who may have missed those lectures, if you would like to see them, they are on our RZSS website via the members portal. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our RZSS president, forgive me, John Spence. Yes, thank you. John Spence, CBE and DL, who will do the honours to introduce our distinguished guest. John.
Thank you, David. Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, great friends of the zoo, good evening. The world had ended. Everybody was dead. All the women and unmarried children had gone straight to heaven, but the men had been ordered to stand in two queues. One queue was for the married men who had been henpecked in their marriage, and the other was the ones who had not. The first queue stretched from Edinburgh to Shetland and back around Scotland several times, while the other queue comprised one person, by name our chairman, Jeremy Pete. God came down to the first queue. You wicked men, you evil men, he said, did I not create women from a mere rib of your body, and you have allowed them to become the commanders of your household? You evil men, I will deal with you later. And he turned to Jeremy and said, my boy, one alone of all this company has met my standards, the ideals for which I created man. Well done. What did you do to make you stand here? Why did you decide to stand here? I didn't, said Jeremy. My wife Pip told me to. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I was worried. I couldn't picture Her Royal Highness as a tribal elder. Oh, I knew she came from a long ancestral line, but we've always thought of the royals as a family rather than a tribe. And I most certainly couldn't think of her as elderly. Far from it. Her youthful encouragement and energy with which she has been our patron over these years has always left us spellbound. But then, of course, it was reminded to me that the tribal elder is all about the passing on of wisdom, of insight, those who have been through the passage of life and who can pass on some secrets to the others. And it is when one realizes that one understands that the Tribal Elder Lecture Programme takes us back to the very core objects of this organisation. The Royal Zoological Society of Scotland has not as its end task the running of zoos. That is what we do to bring and reach out people, but to help them into the wider story of research, of education, and of conservation. And it is all about understanding how we can serve the best things in this wonderful creation, so that we and future generations may understand how they came to be, and what we and our future children need to do to ensure they last. And that is the core of this lecture programme, and that is the reason we are so delighted every one of you is with us tonight. So now I will ask Roger Wheater, who is the outgoing baton holder. This is like a relay race. The princess asked if she was allowed to keep the baton while she was speaking, and I am told she has kept it in order to wallop me if I get out of hand. I will ask Roger Wheater to come down to pass the baton to Her Royal Highness, after which the Princess Royal will address us.
Well, thank you for that passing of the baton. Although I think it's slightly longer than I had in mind, so, but not quite long enough to reach the back of the room. Shouldn't be any heckling or singing at the wrong moments. I would like to say I'm delighted to be here, to be giving the tribal lecture, but you can imagine that comes as a mixed blessing. Actually, John Smith's usual accuracy has taken away quite a lot of my first few sentences. I kind of got the elder bit, but not so much the tribal. Having said that, I think if you followed the logic of the tribal elder, that's a completely separate lecture on tribes, good news, bad news, whether they're really useful and whether they have any benefits, or whether just being the elders, being responsible for passing on knowledge is actually the only critical bit. Now, the thing you have to understand about most members of the family, particularly me, I suspect, is that you are the jack of all trades and master of absolutely none. But we keep trying, which is why I keep coming back. That one day we will learn something that we can really pass on. And that try again to remember things that are really valuable that you can pass on to somebody else. So again, that's why I keep coming back, because this is a really good place to come for that. But I do think it helps to make use of that kind of jack of all trades, master of none information. If you do keep your eyes and ears open as a youngster, or at least you're encouraged to do so, and you're allowed to ask questions, or you're encouraged to observe where you are. And that, I think I was really fortunate, because not only was the family, as a family grew up in the countryside with farm animals and a very strong relationship. And my father, who was already very keen about the concept of the balance of nature in all its forms, was really important. And then I had a governess who used to take us on nature walks, and we had to pick up plants and identify them when we came back. I don't think anybody does that anymore. And you pressed them and named them and kept them, and you identified birds. And somehow that felt, well, it was a bit annoying most of the time. In retrospect, it was really useful. Now this, of course, is the danger of allowing young people to tell you what they want to do, because very little of that will be useful at that stage. You actually have to learn things that you don't think has any immediate relevance in order to make use of it later. But that was the bonus of the kind of background that taught us to be observant, and did take the trouble to look and see what was around you. So that was a pretty good start, I suspect. Although, you talk about sparrows nowadays and how many there were, that kind of age range and your ability to measure how many you saw then and how many you see now is not an accurate observation, but you get a kind of feel for it. And then when people say, I haven't seen any of those for years, you think, it's funny, I'm sure I've seen them every week for the last 50 years, but never mind. I can't prove it. I have no science about my observations. That's my problem. So why you asked me to speak is a bit of a mystery. There is no science. It is about observation, and it is about, I think, being sufficiently interested, not just by my observations, but lots of other people's. And again, I think that was the example that was set within the family in terms of asking questions and the people I met. So I was fortunate, and I had a huge diversity in my life. If my only academic qualifications actually are based around geography, and on that basis I chose not to go to university because I did think that accompanying Her Majesty on her tours might be more interesting, and I'd probably learn more. And I think I'm right. I still think I'm right. Maybe I should have gone and done something with that information, but I keep adding to it, so there's never quite a moment to stop. But it has helped, and it has meant keeping your eyes and ears open and not just being distracted by the things immediately around you. And when you're driving across countries, to notice what's going on in the fields, to notice what the trees are like. Although there are countries where this is more of a challenge. The first time I went to Canada and we drove across Manitoba, I really didn't want to stay awake. It doesn't change much. But it was nonetheless an education in terms of space and scale and the challenges that that creates, certainly for the human population and to some extent for the wild populations as well, but only in terms of what happens to them when man starts to take over a lot of that space and use it in a very different way. So all of those have been, I think, part of my upbringing in terms of observation. One of my earliest visits, in fact it was the earliest visit I made to a Save the Children project, was in Kenya. We did have the opportunity to spend 3 nights under canvas in the Mara and the Game Reserve. And that was at a stage in your career which is very much, it makes a huge impact, I think, on you. If you go at that stage in your career to a place like that and have good guides, good information, and as a very different experience. Exhausting in the sense that under canvas for the first night in the Mara you don't sleep, because every noise seems to contain a threat, and you're not quite sure what's going to walk in through the door of your tent. By the third night you're sleeping really well, but then you got used to most of those noises. So those early childhood influences and the first exposures to other countries do make an impact on what you choose to do. Farming, the impacts of farming, the way our animals are treated, how they've changed, what we did with them, all of that, I suppose, raises a level of interest in terms of how you live together. That was probably just as true in the fact that I continued through competition to understand a bit more about a single animal in terms of its welfare and fitness and how that worked with nutrition and with the land it lived on and the way it lived and its interests and how you kept it interested. I think my interest in horses took me to more places. My competition life took me to more places, but they nearly all of them, because it was a 3-day event, required a bit of countryside to do your cross-country in, always had the opportunity to see other bits of country. So that in itself kept you, again, observation made the difference, the things you could see which were all around you, even when you were in a competition. And I was particularly struck in competing in Russia. That period, this is talking 1973, these were state farms, and the cross-country course went through a field of tomatoes. They hadn't been picked. And I always thought that would be a really silly place to fall off, but it would be. But nobody was interested. They didn't get paid for picking tomatoes, they just got paid. So they went and looked after their own tomatoes in their own hectare. And the same was true of the orchards that we drove past, rings of rotting apples underneath the apple trees. Because they weren't paid to pick those, they were just paid to be there. So they went home to their own hectare and sold their own. Something like 75 to 80% of the fresh fruit and vegetables was sold in the shop. Anything you could buy came off those 1 hectares and was sold on stalls. And that was quite a striking visit, really. And although, I was very lucky because I was on the team and it went to Russia. Most people probably would have said that was just an interesting experience in itself. But if you kept your eyes and ears open, it was a lot more interesting. And if you knew what you were looking for, you would ask questions about it afterwards. The other thing we discovered was that it didn't matter if you were there as part of a sports championship team. If you went out for a meal, if you weren't on the in-tourist list, you didn't get served for at least an hour. It's different now, honest. That was a different, I have to say, a rather different observation. Now, trying to tie things together when you're a jack of all trades is a bit of a challenge. One of the first opportunities I had to do with that was, funny enough, to Save the Children. Now, Save the Children works in many rural areas in a lot of countries. And it works fundamentally doing mother and child healthcare. But to do that, it has to understand how those mothers survive, what their lifestyles are, whether they can improve their nutrition, what they depend upon. And one of the issues that many of those communities faced was deforestation, largely done by the people we were looking after. Because it was all very well us saying to them, you must boil your water, because that's the only safe kind of water there is around here, because nearly every other water that you will find will be contaminated or filthy. But getting them to boil water when the only wood available had already been used up, and you had to walk 3 or 4 miles to find any, was a bit of a challenge. And Save the Children did in the past attempt to fill that gap by planting trees for them. But we didn't have either the experience or indeed the access to the kind of knowledge that would have been really useful in order to have filled that gap back in the 1970s. And sadly, like a lot of other people, we looked around and went, eucalypts, they grow quickly, you can harvest them in 12 years. Not a good idea in Ethiopia, as it happens, but we didn't realise that, and we didn't ask the right people. And I'm not sure that even if the right people had existed, they would have actually thought through the problem in that sort of way. So learning how to connect nature with those families, that they could make better use of it, and understanding the foods that were going to be able to be produced in those different environments and climates was something that many of the Save the Children workers, field workers locally and further afield had a bit of a struggle to try and assess. You're very, very dependent on local populations providing that kind of information because they understood the importance of us understanding that, and not giving them foods which they couldn't access except from somewhere else. Because then you change their tastes, and they tend to then go and want to continue buying particularly wheat flour rather than their local versions. Although having in Ethiopia we were offered some of the local bread, which, I mean, for lack of a better description, looked like dark grey, very similar to tripe. It tastes quite like tripe, but it wasn't very good. Now, you can understand why that if you gave them white bread for any length of time, it did tend to change their tastes. But that sort of grain doesn't grow very well in Ethiopia, so that's not very helpful. So the work that the Save the Children was trying to do in terms of long-term sustainable projects that would benefit mothers and children in those communities in the long term did need more information than we had access to, and a better understanding from maybe other groups who didn't really work out that the impact that was being made was in these communities that were at the edge of survivability and sustainability. And it was no good going to them and saying, no, you mustn't cut down any more trees, and you can't have these animals because they're doing too much damage. That's not going to cut it. You have to come up with a genuine understanding of both the environment and what it is that's going to allow them to survive in the long term. In Ethiopia, it was also already very obvious on the highlands, where sheer weight of numbers had denuded the highlands of Ethiopia, and those people who had been entirely nomadic were starting to settle, and the impact on the land around them completely changed. And it was a desperate sight, I have to say, and that was already early 70s. And I'm not sure we were providing the right kind of help. We could help them reduce the infant mortality rate really quite quickly, but we couldn't help them produce any more food quickly. And we couldn't give them access to clean water any more quickly. And I have to say that it's one of the lessons that I'm still struck by, that we don't, and maybe it's become more difficult in some ways. Save the Children is a development agency. Eglantine saw her role as to introduce the concepts that local people would find beneficial in the long term for them to do, not for somebody else to do to them, something that would be understandable and affordable. And we still like to approach it that way, but bringing together the various threads that will make a difference for those communities in different places is still a bit of a challenge, I think, for international agencies. And if they become too single issue, we're not going to make an enormous improvement on the environment in which they live, and it won't sustain them that much better in the long term. And I learned very early on that if you're talking about conservation, you can't talk about it in an abstract. You have to talk about it bearing in mind the people who are closest to it. They may be responsible for it, but it's understanding why and how you can help them to make a difference. I was delighted to be asked to become patron of the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust as it was in 1972. Although I have to admit that in retrospect I now know that perhaps the Director General might not have been quite so impressed when he heard I'd been asked, but there you go. He was extremely generous to me after we met, and it was always a pleasure to go there. But he also had a real understanding of the place that people had in the conservation of habitats and individual species. And he was much better at communicating that than I will ever be. And my other observation, I have to say, is that my early, perhaps the most enjoyable part of the early learning curve was reading Gerald Orwell's books, of course. I would love to ask how many of you haven't read Gerald Orwell's books, but that is a really good starting point for anybody who has an interest in conservation and the enthusiasm and motivation that is required. And it starts when you're very young. And it can grow from some of the most unlikely and not so attractive beings that we share our planet with, but have a really important place, and we need to get to know them. And Gerald really did that. But the atmosphere on Jersey, the interest, the understanding of the species they were involved in, it wasn't just a question of these are rare breeds, they need to be saved, we put a male and female together and we'll look after the youngsters and that will be it. No, that was never it in Jersey. There's a real understanding of the psychology behind these species and how they lived, and understanding the things that they needed to make them want to breed and want to be successful. And an understanding that the less was more in terms of those individuals being able to get on with it. And indeed understanding all of the animals and their care, whether they were good at breeding or not. And I shouldn't say this because I know that Lily's going to be a much more interesting tribal elder next year, and she'll give you all the details, but I was hugely struck. We were talking about zoos. I went there one late autumn, and the gorillas in those days were in an older enclosure, a big glass front, concrete, and they were rather depressed. And I guess, as you would have assumed they would have done, because the weather was turned. And Gerald explained to me, he says, no, it's nothing to do with that. He said, in the winter I tell all the staff that wherever they go in the park, they must go past the gorillas. Because the trouble is, he said, in the season, he said, they think the people are there to entertain them. So in the winter, they're bold. So make sure you go past. Now, I think that's good psychology. And that's, in many respects, why it's been so successful. And it was that, well, certainly the first introduction to saving species from extinction, but so much with also not just there, but understanding where they came from and that they would go back there. And that was key. And the encouragement for people in those countries and in those areas to understand the necessity for that breeding and how to be able to create the right environment for them to return to it, that they would have a much better chance of success. And I know that if you go to Mauritius, that's been a very classic tale of some really good programs that have been introduced, and they're really proud of the success of what they've done. There is another connection. I mean, I've had the opportunity to visit some of the trust work in Belize, particularly in Mauritius, in Brazil, and in Madagascar. Although Madagascar is one of those places where I'm trying to go back to, and is, I think, under real threat from many different directions. And I really hope that that education of the local population to understand the value of what Darrell is doing there will be able to be maintained. Because one of the connections that was made through Darrell was through Edward Whitley and his awards. And Edward was a volunteer for Darrell, but he very much took on board this understanding the local population's perspective in terms of what they could do for conservation. And the awards that they now present are very much about local heroes, very often unpopular, standing up against quite a lot of vested interests frequently, and economic pressures on the other hand. And they found some really extraordinary heroes of conservation who have done that, sometimes in the most interesting ways. And it really proves that, I think some of these individuals really prove that you don't have to be terribly clever to be able to do this, but you have to be enthusiastic and committed. Because one of the award winners she was a dentist, but she understood the value of their forests, and she understood that the replanting program was absolutely key. And she worked out a way of encouraging people to plant trees by giving them free dental treatments. Now, you might not think that was a very attractive proposition, but it worked remarkably well. And I think it is quite important to learn that there is more than one way to... No, but perhaps I better not use that. But there is. And it's and giving those people that support. And actually, as you have done from Edinburgh, because in fact one of those award winners is in an Edinburgh project with the armadillos, very importantly. And again, a struggle for him, because it's not one of those species which gets a huge amount of interest and support, and he's done extraordinarily well in that area, and I hope that prize will help him. I think the connections that Darrell and, well, I would argue here, the RZSS too, the connections with animals, understanding the connections, understanding how they function is a particularly important part of what you do, and getting that message across. And it's not just with the charismatic animals that get the headlines that look good in pictures. And with great respect to pandas, that's, fine. But there are the much more obscure species, island dwellers, like your Partula snails, and the rainforest dwellers, like your leafcutter ants, and those little known species that really are the nuts and bolts of the planet's ecology, and somebody has got to look out for them. And okay, you can use the pandas, very good, highlight what you do, but make sure that you make the best possible use of that level of interest to help all the others which are an essential part of the jigsaw. And that's, I think we've seen, certainly in my travels, and explaining right the way up through the system, the value to each other. You cannot isolate any species, really. Understanding it is one thing, but it fits in somewhere. And the interdependency is a really key part of the process. In Brazil, I know they've done a lot of corridor planting because of the importance of connecting all these things together to allow the birds and the insects and to have the right floral plants in those corridors, to allow those connections to go on being made in spite of man's interfering to some extent with their ability to travel. And that's a really important part of understanding where we sit. All of this, I think, connects really well with what the zoo here has been doing for a long time. I know it's changed, but that initial founding of the zoo was designed around raising people's understanding and awareness of what existed. But it has evolved, and it's evolved very rapidly, and it's evolved extraordinarily well. Now, I've been patron for about 6 years, and it has changed even in that short space of time. Very much, it has an attraction-led zoo, which is an important part of raising the profile. But it is also now one of the preeminent wildlife conservation organisations anywhere, because it understands how to make use of all that information. So the Society's commitment, both to the native species, which are very important for the educational process here, and the endangered wildlife around the globe, I think is exemplary. I think it's a really good mixture of the knowledge that you have and how you mix it together. There's the Scottish wildcat breeding programme, and I'm sure you've seen some pictures there from time to time. Your extensive education outreach programme, and that starts with very young children, it's absolutely right, and ranges right up through the short courses for adults. Your Wild About Scotland bus, which has done a great job touring the length and breadth of Scotland, helping young people, well, helping the schools mostly to get young people out, because the schools do need support to do some of the things they'd really like to do, and the bus does help them to do that. Your Wild Genes Genetics Laboratory, so that's using cutting-edge molecular genetics techniques, particularly in this instance help save those rhinos and the elephants from the grisly and unfortunately far too common fate from poaching, which happens, I'm afraid, still far too often in the illegal wildlife trade. Your captive breeding programs are still very pioneering. You've introduced the snow and the Amur leopards as well. And the tigers that are up the Highland Wildlife Park are, again, finding the right environment for them and making sure they're happy has been an extraordinary success. But you host those special events like Vulture and Rhino Awareness Days and a bee festival. You might need to do more of those. All created to shed their spotlight on the plights of vanishing species. And again, if you don't have the two working in combination to raise the profile that people look to see what else is going on. They think, oh, I enjoyed that. What else is happening? Look to see what else is happening. Getting people to understand that there is more to discover and that it is immediately around you. And I've had the opportunity to meet some of those teams involved in those efforts and developing those new initiatives to balance that human and wildlife need. And that's what I was talking about earlier. This is how they're carrying it on. They're in the field stations in Budongo in Uganda, in Patanal in Brazil, Oman, Abu Dhabi, the Himalayan wolves in Kathmandu, the Dharma gazelles in Mali, Chad and Niger. None of these are easy places to work, but they're places where people, above all, not us, the people in Mali, Chad and Niger need to understand the importance of what we're doing. And you have to work alongside them to understand what their fears are, why those cats are under threat, what is the local attitudes towards them, and how can you make them feel more confident that they really do need to be there for the long term. Natural habitats is the same thing, linked to those, to the wild cats, coral reefs, which are fundamental to so many parts of that equation. And I'm glad to say that in I sail quite a lot still off the west coast of Scotland, but there was a gap in my experience, again observation from when my father took us sailing, lots of basking sharks. In between that, none. Now, lots of basking sharks. I defy anybody to come up with an answer to that question. I'm not entirely sure you know. But it's really nice to see them back, and I hope they will stay. The other thing about I think you do really well is giving people the opportunity to get close. Because actually that's something that only a few people normally get the chance to do. Now those of us who had the chance to go on safaris in Africa are amazed how close you can get to wild animals, but actually that's may not be the best way of doing it. You can get close here, close enough to enthuse the youngsters into asking more, close enough to get them interested, maybe a little frightened, but much more likely to ask the questions about where they came from and why they're there. And that close-up experience, particularly in Highland Park, is very well done. The polar bears are very accessible. The rhinos are extraordinarily accessible, and they're very nice. I think you may have a challenge with the beavers. Because although I've seen where the beavers are, I don't actually see one. But they're there, I know, yes. Because I've seen what they've done and how efficient they are. We don't actually see them. But we know they're there. Actually, we know there are lots more of them out there, but not necessarily in the places where. But I think the rhinos do illustrate really well that organisations like the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland and our Wildlife Conservation Trust are really all about. It's partly the business of understanding that a species is really at risk, how you understand how to breed them, how you understand the habitats and the local communities so that you can replace them, and whether that is indeed possible. And I hope that will be true for those rhinos, but that requires a lot more education and understanding of how we can do that. And linked to that, the ability through that access of carrying out the more scientific work, the vital research on their biology and ecology. And that will certainly help us in the long term, but that has to go along with building the capacity of the local human communities to be the good stewards of their environment, and hopefully to enable many more people to visit, not just in themselves, in the flesh, but to make some use of the modern technology to connect people online, so that they actually can keep a probably, if not closer, eye on what is going on. And it is about learning to use communications, isn't it? The tribal elder bit comes to a grinding halt here, because the technology is theory only, as far as I'm concerned. I understand what it should be able to do in terms of rating profile, getting the message across. I still find the ability to even download the newspaper is a very iffy business. Should work, but doesn't usually. But I know that equally, that for the future, understanding how to communicate will be absolutely vital to us being able to continue the work that you want to do. Through networking, through using IT, through using online, sharing knowledge across the globe on the research levels. But I would argue that the education is not about the academic qualifications, it is about interest levels, it's about getting people just to ask questions why things are there, why they're important, what is the balance, what do they create that is important to this world. And that should be done as soon as possible and is part of education, which in my Oxford English Dictionary is still defined as training for life. And I think that is part of life, it's understanding where we sit in that equation. And that for me, is still part of, and I was deeply depressed, perhaps nobody else noticed this, but I think I saw the other day that the Oxford English Dictionary had dropped, was it 3 names of common plants and animals from the dictionary because they said they somehow weren't modern enough. No, that's not what it's for. It's not for them to decide whether these creatures are modern or interesting. Should jolly well be there. That's a really interesting piece of logic, I thought. I mean, they exist. Come on. The new words are a passing phase. With respect to those in the back row who probably use the language, is a passing phase. It will change. We'll have to catch up, I know. But it will be a part that we're going to have to learn in order to get that message across and to maintain some of the knowledge and make sure it's there. And the other one that I also enjoyed quoting is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. I'm afraid this is not original. Actually, somebody wrote a letter to the newspaper who said that they were always told that the difference between knowledge and wisdom was knowledge was knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in your fruit salad. That's kind of where I sit. That's my definition of knowledge. And I think it indicates there is a subtlety here, which isn't all about just collecting data and just having as much knowledge as you can, which is available, but doesn't come with any connection to life and to what you might do with that. That's another reason why this society is so important, because I think it does exactly that. I think it takes a lot of that knowledge and tries to balance that with the wisdom, the things you really need to know. And for people like me, for whom that jack of all trades, that's really important, that you need to have the essence of what is important to these organisations and to the differences that they can make. Then I can leave it up to the specialists to do the nitty-gritty bits and to tie the loose ends together. But having that rather more holistic view, which is probably how I was brought up, it's probably the experience that I got through Save the Children, because again it's holistic, it's understanding the environment which people are living, which you're going to try and make a difference with, is how I see this society and where it sits. Its ability to pursue real knowledge, but to be able to pass on wisdom from that knowledge, which is a real benefit to your community and those who live around it and those you're in contact with. It is a global environment now, and so it's not quite as easy perhaps as it was, but if you can define the wisdom part of it, that's global. That is the piece of information that you really need to have that is going to make the difference. But we do need to understand how it's going to work in any of the places that we want it to. As I say, I pick up a lot of information on my travels. I like coming back here because I pick up more. But the joy of being patron here is I have a slightly higher degree of continuity because I can come back more often. You learn a little bit more about that passage and how it's working, because it doesn't always work in the way in which you want it to. And as we know, discussions about reintroductions of different varieties of wildlife, you really do have to think it through to see what the unintended consequence might be, preferably before it happens, rather than afterwards. And I've seen a few unintended consequences in my time. But that continuity is here. And I think what you do is well worth shouting about. I think it has real value for the future. It has real value for not just Scotland, but the globe. It's given me a much firmer base, along with my other experiences, to see where conservation sits and how it should work, possibly in the future. We have to learn to be a bit more flexible again, I think, as a species, we humans. We probably were a bit more flexible, But we've decided that we want a fixed habitat. We're fixing our abodes. We think we've got the right amount of heat and the right amount of cold. Kind of makes it less flexible. I think we've got to remember that we still have to be flexible. And we still have to learn from the nature that's round about us, in that sense, that we have to be flexible. And we have to take some clues from those that we look after, that maybe they're better suited to that role of adaptation and moving on. And we need to go on learning. We need to make sure we keep our minds open to that. It is a constant process. And I'm really grateful that you find so many people here who not only care deeply for the animals and the species that they are responsible for, but they also understand that this is a message that needs to be got across to other people, because everybody needs to be responsible for themselves and the places that they live in. And that is a real struggle for the future, is to embed in everybody that sense of responsibility about their environment and the impact that they have on it. I would suggest you get a tribal elder for the future who can do a bit on waste and energy, but it won't be me. But I think it's a pretty good place to start, and I wish you luck with that. But it's, as I say, it's a pleasure to be part of this society and what it has achieved, which you have a lot to celebrate. But really the potential is still just as big. And with help from supporters like your good selves who come to the events like this, and the points that your previous tribal elders have made, I'm sure, will make this an organisation with a membership to be feared around the globe, with the level of information, knowledge and wisdom contained in it. So thank you, and I hope above all you will manage to enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you for a most heartfelt and inspiring lecture. And we have time for a few questions from the audience before we do the proper vote of thanks. So, would you like to choose, or shall I? A question.
There are no hands up, so I'll do it.
Who would like to offer a question, please?
What's your favourite part of the world to visit animals?
I don't do favourites. I don't do favourites ever, but I'm very keen on red squirrels.
May we have another?
You don't have to.
Anyone else? Yes, please. John? Please.
Is there one piece of wisdom you would share that would help give us kind of hope for conservation when we're faced with rising populations, demands on resources? What can we do to really make a difference?
One of the struggles about conservation is you tend to only see the bad news in a way, because it makes better media coverage. But one of the things that strikes me about the Whitley Awards is you see a lot of good news in those award winners and what they have achieved. And I think supporting local efforts and just being more local, and after all that was very much the founders here, thinking global, think local. It is an important part of the equation. We have to make sure that it's at a level which people can buy into. That it's not something that's being imposed upon them all the time. And that's finding the people who are really working alongside those who have to be convinced that there is real value in what you're asking them to do.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please, sir.
Your Royal Highness, how do you think that we can educate the public more about the realities of conservation? You mentioned red squirrels, that save the red squirrels, we've got to kill the grey squirrels to stop overgrazing, we have to reduce the deer herd. How do we get that message across to the public in a better way? Because I think that might be one of our biggest challenges.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, as told at the Highland Park, if you want to reintroduce things, you've got to work on the basis you will have to cull. And it's the balance of nature that we find difficult to manage. I think I talked earlier about this sort of single issue aspect. And the single issue aspect is sometimes quite helpful for raising the profile of things that are in danger, but it doesn't help in the long term because it then isolates them from the order in which they need to sit. And grey squirrels is a classic argument. I mean, it's not. Well, I can show you the damage to my trees. So, you can ask me to plant more trees, but I mean, you can argue that actually, while there are that many grey squirrels, there's not much point. And you do have to understand where that balance is. That has been a very difficult debate to have. There are only certain people who can do this. David Bellamy was good at that. He could tell people to go out and shoot a stag. Sure I could, but that's not the same thing, is it? It's that balance which is really difficult to get the message across because people are so isolated from that. And arguably, you see, they say, well, why don't you put it in a zoo? No, that's not the answer. And that's something that you have to sort of wind back from. But you're quite right, I mean, that the whole balance, and because humans have interfered so much in terms of that balance, humans are still going to have to do something about maintaining the balance so that that species or whatever it is going to remain healthy. Because sheer weight of numbers is not going to do it.
Young lady? Yes, I do have a question. You say you asked, so you say when you were younger you observed. How can us as adults observe as a child does? Because as adults it's harder to do, to observe around the world. But how can we do that as an adult as we did as a child?
I think you go on doing the same thing. And then if you want to, you go on picking things as you see them and take them home and identify them. You go on taking the bird book with you and check and see what you're looking at. And it's remaining curious. I think that's how you do it. You just go on asking questions. But you remain curious. But keep the bird book. Keep the plant book. Try a few. There are certain types of flowers which do really well in the bottom left-hand oven of the Argo.
On that note, I would love to invite our chairman, Jeremy Peterby, to please offer the vote of thanks.
Your Royal Highness, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, it is a huge pleasure and privilege as chair of the trustees of the RZSS and the only unhenpecked man in the House, which is a strange thing to think about, to deliver a vote of thanks to our wonderful royal patron for that remarkable address and also for so kindly answering those questions. We have a great deal to thank Her Royal Highness for over the 6 years or more for which she has been royal patron. We are very much in her debt. That was particularly evident during our centenary year, and it was wholly appropriate that the Rosa Princess Anne should be the first to bloom in the RZSS Centenary Garden that was created by our gardens team to celebrate both our centenary and our royal patronage. Her Royal Highness has been a really regular visitor to this park and to the Highland Wildlife Park over the years, and has been generally a fantastic supporter of the Society. And I hope that will apply for many years to come. And from listening to Her Royal Highness this evening, it's absolutely clear she knows where we are and she knows where we should be. And that guidance will always be really helpful and welcome. We were thrilled when you agreed, ma'am, to address the Society as one of our tribal elders, and I, like others, are going to explain that the phrase tribal elders really emphasises wisdom and wide-ranging experience. And you have demonstrated that. I was particularly fascinated by your reference to exposure to other cultures and to other countries. I spent most of the first 15 years of my life as a development economist, and I never regret the experiences I have learned during that period. And Budongo, our wonderful park over in Uganda, is not just about chimpanzees. It's about the interaction between chimpanzees and people and learning how that can work together. And to an extent, similarly with our giant armadillo program. So that matters so much. I want to just take the opportunity to refer to the Indian rhinos that you mentioned, and where we saw pictures of yourself and your lady-in-waiting feeding them. That was a great experience we all had. I think it's not quite as scary as watching you feed the polar bears, but up close and personal, most certainly with our big boys. But our rhinos are wonderful, and they are a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate to young people and others about wildlife and to get them up close, to get them to understand. But I want so much more. I want to be able to breed from our rhinos. We've got 2 young males, and they're great, they're fantastic. But I would like, just as with our sun bears, not to have 2 young males, but to have a young male and a young female, and to breed so that we not only contribute to education, but we contribute to conservation of these important species. But that costs a lot of money. The cost of changing our existing enclosures to be suitable for breeding pairs of rhinos and breeding pairs of the sun bears is at the moment beyond our capability. And so I ask all of you here, I thank you for all that you've done in contributing to the society and supporting us. But I say, please keep on doing it. Please do more. Please encourage your friends to do more. I would love to think that in 2016 and 2017 we can have enclosures for breeding those lovely Indian rhinos and for the sun bears, in addition to the amber leopards and snow leopards like the Highland Wildlife Park, in addition to the polar bears up there, in addition to our Sumatran tigers, which I gather are getting quite friendly now, which is very good news. So there's so much more that I would like to do, and I would like to take from tonight and everything else that we are working on conservation, we are working on education, we are working on research, and I believe we're doing so in a very productive manner. But really that's enough of the advertorial for tonight. I now would like to move on to ask Your Royal Highness if you would step forward again, and I would like to ask our silversmith in residence, Brownie Knox, to come forward with a special gift that she has produced for you. And this gift is a hand-woven tray that Chris West brought back from Budongo, that was from the ladies of Budongo. So that is for you.
This is a silver hair comb that's been designed especially for you, and when based on the rhinos in the zoo here, and when you're not wearing it, it simply slots into this letter holder behind, so it becomes decoration in the letter holder as well.
That is beautiful.
Isn't that lovely?
Well, the whole thing is lovely.
And this is the wonderful tray on top.
There you go.
Well, Chris just brought that back the other day. Especially hand-woven.
How very kind. Thank you very much indeed.
My final task this evening is actually to ask our Chief Executive, Professor Chris West, to come forward with our next speaker, Lee Durham, because he has a very difficult task to perform now. The difficult task is not to introduce Lee Durham, but the difficult task is to ask you, Your Royal Highness, to pass on the baton. So I pass that over to Chris West.
He's just stolen my lance. Stolen my thunder. Your Royal Highness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, if I may just briefly echo the appreciation that Jeremy's just shown. I think I'd just say two things. One is you can't beat sharp observation and straightforward common sense. So I'm a scientist, but and the other thing is that conservation ultimately, to be successful, is all about people. And I think that connectivity and balancing was the strong message that resonated with me from your talk. It's all about people. So we're all about people. But actually my job is to make an announcement, and that announcement is that the next tribal elder is going to be Dr. Lee Durrell. And it's on April the 14th next year. Sorry. And we're very fortunate in having our royal patron, but of course the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust shares the same patron. So amongst the many things that we share with Durrell, it's a terrific royal patron. Now, the ritual part of the tribal elder that we're just about to enact is that the current tribal elder has to hand over the baton to the next tribal elder. So I'm going to ask you nicely, because you've only had it for a very short period of time, and it's a very splendid baton. But would you mind terribly giving it?
It was really wild, so thank you so much. That's fine. So you've got to look after it. I should have known. Great advantage about this was that I didn't have to remember where I put it.
Your Royal Highness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, this will be very, very short. I just want to say what a great privilege and honour it is to receive this baton from Her Royal Highness and to be asked to be the RZSS's next tribal elder. And I very much look forward to seeing you all next April when I shall speak. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to say one or two things about Lee, but bear in mind that when you come back on April 14th, you will hear it again. I first met Lee in 1978, and I was a vet student, and it was the occasion of the 21st birthday of the Trust, and there was a hell of a party. And I can't remember a huge amount about it, but thankfully our paths have crisscrossed ever since then, and I never thought, though, that we would ask you to be a tribal elder. So there we are. Lee is a conservationist, she's a naturalist, she's an author, she's a television presenter, and of course her name is synonymous with that great zoo in Jersey that was founded by the late, great Gerald Durrell. She did her PhD research on the calls of various mammals and birds in Madagascar and retains a huge affection, commitment to the people and the nature of Madagascar. And I think it's true to say that in certain parts of Madagascar you are referred to as Mother Tortoise.
Grandmother.
Oh, Grandmother Tortoise. It's a qualification for tribal eldership. Well, if you want to find out why Lee is called Grandmother Tortoise, you're going to have to come back on April 14th. So, just to really sum things up this evening, it's been a marvellous special occasion, and there's been a lot of wisdom shared. Thank you. In terms of the similarity between Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust and the RZSS, I think I would just finish by saying that we have remarkably similar mission statements. It's about saving animals, species from extinction, and then it's about connecting people with nature. So I think, if I may, that as we go home and safe journeys, it's thinking about that connection with nature that we can have as individuals. And then to echo Jeremy, what are we going to do about that? So, now, if you all stand, please, that will allow the royal party to exit from the front because there are going to be some photographs. And then at the risk of being a sort of flight attendant, I think you've been briefed to exit row by row. Thank you very much. And as I'm saying thank you, I'd like to thank you all for coming, for your support, for being a terrific audience, and also there have to be one or two thank yous to the key people who've made an occasion like this happen. So Kathy Sawley as the thinker in residence, without you. And Lynn MacDonald from Eye to Detail, who has an eye to detail. Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.